National Commission dealt extensively with special populations, fetuses, prisoners, persons who were decisionally impaired, mentally ill, dealt with minors. And so all of those special and thus more vulnerable, or vulnerable and thus special populations, were foci of our early conferences. And again, there was great confusion about how to determine competency, when, for example, a child could give consent versus assent. Certainly a lot of concern about research in prisons using prisoners who were clearly very, very vulnerable because of the coercion factor. So the first couple of conferences were very steeped in the regulations, establishment of IRB, special populations. We did an early conference in 78, 79 on behavioral social science issues as well. We limited that conference to those issues. We wanted to make certain that the behavioral social science aspects of research protocols were not overlooked. Many people worried simply about physical harm, but we understood that there were many other types of harm, such as that inflicted by the Zimbardo and Milgram and many other studies that had been done without any ethical oversight. So we wanted to make certain that those types of trials were not ignored in the community's efforts to try to embody both the spirit and letter of the National Commission's work and the subsequent regulations. In the early 80s, we had a conference on drug and device research, and we, in our determination to try to be a convener of the entire community, we moved that meeting to Philadelphia. It was our first non-Boston meeting. And we wanted to make sure that the pharmaceutical industry, the device industry, at that point there was not much of a biotech industry, but we wanted to make certain that the pharmaceutical industry could be there easily. And so we went to the mountain, as it were, and really focused on the ethical issues as well as the scientific design and IRB issues relevant to pharmaceutical trials.
How did you actually grapple with these issues at the conferences so that you were achieving more clarity, as you were saying, in terms of how IRBs actually functioned on the ground?
I think it's really that magical, almost indescribable process that takes place when you have committed people, experienced, involved people, and certainly caring, principled, intelligent people who are sharing common problems and who are struggling with approaches to those problems. And we were always, from the beginning, very persuaded that if you bring people of conscience and competence together with a very skilled either moderator or facilitator or speaker, depending on the kind of session. We have many different formats. We have workshops, we have didactic sessions, we have plenary sessions. But that, you know, with a skilled leader, be it a moderator or a lecturer, and people who are motivated and principled, that there is this, again, quite remarkable process that unfolds. In bioethics and ethics in general, there are no easy answers, and quite often there are no answers. So it's a matter of, you know, going on this magical mystery tour to try to come up with best practices or with workable approaches. So there was nothing, again, mystical or magical about what we did. It was simply bringing people together to share and having the regulators listen and believing, as we did and as has been borne out to be a very productive approach, it is that wisdom of crowds, not in the New Age sense, but in the more traditional practical one.
The 1980s also saw the emergence of a major health epidemic, the AIDS crisis, that forced the country as a whole, and certainly the medical research community in particular, to take notice. Can you tell us about PRIM&R's relationship to the AIDS crisis and the search for a cure, or at least the means to control the disease?
Yes. So quite soon after the emergence of the epidemic, it came to certainly our board's attention and mine as well. It came to everyone's attention that this was terrifying. This was a plague. This was unprecedented in terms of its both impact and and the fact that there was nothing in the armamentarium that could be employed against it. There was nothing, and it was striking such huge numbers of people around the world, but at that point we were focused on our country. And we decided that because there were so many ethical dimensions that we had to dive in early and deeply. And among the ethical dimensions were, again, the fact that the population, mostly gay men, were, if not vulnerable in traditional terms, were certainly vulnerable in terms of privacy, vulnerable in terms of stigmatization, vulnerable in terms of general bias, both from caregivers and certainly from community as well. They were often treated like pariahs if and when their diagnosis, even of HIV, not full-blown AIDS, became known. So given the ethical issues, the many ethical issues, we started to immediately get involved. Very quickly, the gay community proved itself to be the most forceful, effective, and otherwise impressive advocates that the governmental, medical, industrial complex had ever seen. And it really changed the nature of clinical trials and drug development because there was nothing to treat AIDS. There were stories of people who were losing 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 friends per year for periods of years. And so the gay community, both gay men and lesbians, banded together and thought, we're not waiting. We're not going to allow the wheels to grind slowly. We have no time. And so their remarkable odyssey via groups like ACT UP and TAG, the Treatment Action Group, are by now well documented in films like How to Survive a Plague. And they just said, we've got to have a better way of getting drugs approved. We've got to either fast-track drugs. We've got to either improve the compassionate use of drugs. We've got to have something. And we understand biostatistics. We understand drug development. We're going to educate ourselves about the chemistry and the molecular biology. And so there has never been such an involved, hands-on group of advocates and, in fact, research subjects as the AIDS sufferers from the gay community. So PRIM&R got very involved with a number of people from ACT UP. We were privileged to have Mark Harrington and some others at our meeting. Similarly, Surgeon General C. Everett Koop came to PRIM&R's conferences, 2 of them, and that was extraordinary. We had Merv Silverman, who was the head of the health department in San Francisco. We had Matilda Krim, a remarkable woman scientist who was the founder of AMFAR. So PRIM&R was the very lucky beneficiary of all the talent, or at least a good share of the very high profile talent in the field. Jonathan Mann here in Boston, Marty Hirsch here in Boston. So many people were here, Jerry Groupman, Harvey Macadon, Deborah Cotton. We were just in the right place at the right time and started having meetings that really were able to bring, if not total clarity, then at least improved clarity to the ethical issues surrounding AIDS research. They were multiple.
So what would you say were the primary lessons for PRIM&R that emerged from the AIDS crisis, and how did PRIM&R incorporate those lessons into its work going forward from that point?
I always believed it was important to hear from those most affected by any situation. For example, in the disabilities rights movement, to involve people with disabilities, and certainly with respect to research, it would have been ideal from the beginnings of PRIM&R to involve research subjects. But before the AIDS epidemic, it was not so easy to identify subjects. There were privacy issues, and again, the field was just very new and embryonic, and so it wasn't so easy to find research subjects. We often found advocates. But here, the persons with HIV and with AIDS were taken to the streets and to the microphones and to the TV screens, so we were able to actually work with the subject community, have some of them at our conferences, to have dialogues with them, and that reinforced my already existing and strong belief that hearing from the affected subject population was crucial. And once we successfully forged those coalitions with people with HIV and AIDS, we never looked back, and we've continued to involve subjects in many, if not most of our conferences, subjects or their representatives. So that was huge. I think it also wasn't necessarily restricted to PRIM&R, but I think the AIDS activists showed the entire research establishment that out-of-the-box thinking and trying to be much more creative and responsive and not homogenizing clinical trials, really taking each disease or condition and each subject cohort and treating it individually. Before there was this one gold standard, you do these randomized trials, and often, if not always, placebos were used, even though the FDA does not require them. And it was a traditional and fairly moribund model. And so AIDS just woke everybody up and said, there are many roads to Rome. Let's try to be much more creative. Let's try to think about these parallel track drug development processes. Let's really think out of the box and try to really respond to this remarkable gift we've been given of these intelligent, politically savvy, and obviously very motivated activists.
Tell us about C. Everett Koop's relationship with PRIM&R.
So, I said to, in those days, 3 or 4 people were planning the conferences along, with me. And I said, I'm going to invite the Surgeon General. And I remember them laughing and saying, good luck. He's got better things to do than to truck up to Boston. Well, it so happened that I had gone to Dartmouth, and C. Everett Koop had gone to Dartmouth, and his sons had gone to Dartmouth, and he had a very strong affection for Dartmouth, and he had a home up in that area. And so I knew that because he had been several times referenced in the alumni magazine. And so I was not proud. I used the Dartmouth angle and the fact that, I too had a very small home up there, and just tried to let him know that that he was wanted in such a way that I was going to pull out all the stops. And remarkably, he came. We were at that point, less than 10 years old. No one had heard of PRIM&R. This was pre-personal computers, pre any kind of digital devices, at least that were personal digital devices. And he said yes, and everybody was flabbergasted, primarily I. And so I was his self-appointed escort for 24 hours, which was amazing. And a group of 20 of us took him out to dinner on Beacon Hill. He was wonderful. I have pictures of that evening. And he was quite extraordinary. Among other reasons, C. Everett Koop was a very devout Christian. And prior to becoming Surgeon General, he had been a surgeon at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, CHOP. And he was known to do anything to save a baby because he really had this, every life is understandably fragile and precious. And that was extended to his having very strong anti-choice sentiments. And so when AIDS came along, people assumed that because of his devout Christianity, he might also have an anti-gay sentiment. And that proved, thankfully, to be the farthest thing from the truth. He dove into the AIDS crisis without reservation. He had a booklet printed, and he used the franking system to send it to every single household in the country. Because again, at this time, there was widespread hysteria about you cannot shake hands with someone with AIDS, and you cannot hug them, and or HIV, you can't share a room with them, and you can't share a glass. And it was leading to, again, this notion of AIDS sufferers, people with HIV or AIDS, being treated like lepers. And it was horrible. And he used his bully pulpit to dispel that, or at least to try to dispel that hysteria through scientific information. AIDS is very difficult to transmit under normal circumstances, with casual contact. And he really said that over and over, not just through this remarkable booklet that went to every household, but through unending public appearances and speech and radio and TV appearances. He really was determined to end the isolation of people suffering from HIV or AIDS and to educate the American population about how compassion and research and treatment were necessary, not hostility and isolation. So he became a hero of mine. And we stayed in touch for 20 years until his death. And I got to see him on a few more occasions. And I was an unabashed admirer. And again, he and I would not have probably had common cause but for his devotion to making sure people with HIV and AIDS were treated well, because before that opportunity, he was known as a very conservative and otherwise, traditional practitioner, albeit a phenomenal one. Again, there were several changes not only in the drug regulatory process, but one of the most enduring impacts of the HIV/AIDS activists was that the FDA and the NIH started to put many more consumers on its boards, on its commissions, on its review panels. So,
what does consumers mean?
Consumers, great question. It either means a research subject or someone who represents a research subject or someone who works with research subjects. Again, it could be family members, it could be subjects themselves, it could be partners of subjects, or it could be advocates who work for organizations that are voluntary health organizations representing a single or a couple of different disorders. So the FDA and NIH really understood that what were then called consumer activists deserved a seat at the table. So the AIDS activists legitimized the involvement of consumer activists or consumer advocates, or at least consumer representatives for all of federally funded research. And that impact has lasted until this day. Many people criticize it and saying, too little, too late, one per committee or two per committee. But the involvement of consumers, again, which is operationally defined, as I mentioned earlier, has been a huge impact that has made a difference. And again, if there were more of them, it would make a greater difference. We were able to attract the regulators to our conferences almost from the very beginning. And they too, it's the same principle. They too understood that our community, our attendees, were their consumers. They were their community of regulated institutions. So they wanted to hear what the regulated institutions had to say. And so they listened very carefully. And for example, there were proposed regulations on human subject protections in '79. And Charlie McCarthy, who was then the director of Office for Protection from Research Risks, came with most of his staff to our meetings between '79 and '81. And a lot of what he heard and a lot of the discussions in which he participated changed the course of what became the regulations issued in '81, which are what we now refer to as the common rule, the regulations for the protection of human subjects. And so just because we had the right people and we were perceived rightly as an independent organization that was not beholden to any one sector, neither the government nor the academic institutions nor the industry, we were able to be, as you said earlier, the convener, and parlayed that very effectively into having a voice in the regulatory process. So the regulations, by Charlie McCarthy's own admission, were forged at the PRIM&R, or at least were partially forged at the PRIM&R conferences. They certainly had a sense of what the framework was, and then a lot of the details were worked out in the auditoria and conference rooms at our meetings.
In the early years, PRIM&R operated as a board of directors. And then in 1986, ARENA was founded. So can you tell us about the impetus for that and actually start with what ARENA actually means?
ARENA means Applied Research Ethics National Association. And it was a wonderful confluence of an acronym representing a visual and certainly a principle, because we really did see ourselves as this round table, an arena where everybody was welcome, round amphitheater, whatever. It really was a come one, come all, come participate in our activities. And very soon after PRIM&R's founding, it became clear that there were different constituencies who were interested in our educational programs, because research is comprised of many different constituencies. Clearly, there were the researchers and research staff. Quite often, those were the ones who didn't really see the need for education, particularly the researchers. The research staff were at the behest of the researchers, so if the researchers didn't think it was important, quite often the research staff would not be encouraged or even allowed to come to our meetings. There were the people who were running IRBs, either as chairs or administrators or administrative staff, or even institutional officials at the institutions and hospitals who had the authority and the mandate to make sure that the regulations were being carried out. There were funders and sponsors. There were federal officials and their employees, and there were advocates and subjects and representatives of advocates and subjects. We learned quite early on in our conferences, within 2 or 3 years, that the interests of these different parties were quite often at odds. For example, the IRBs felt from the beginning that they were under-resourced. There were very few exceptions. I'm speaking generally, I know, but there were very few exceptions to that rule because institutions were not sufficiently supporting in financial terms, and quite often in other terms as well, IRBs. As one of my colleagues, Leonard Glantz, says, the IRB does not bring in money, so it's less important to an institution than a parking lot or a snack bar. So there was this perennial divide between the IRB staff and the institutional administration. Similarly, there were often divides between government and institutional officials, between funders and institutional officials, between funders and government. It was a field that was fractured and fractious. So because the IRB community were the ones who were on the ground, on the front lines, really their mandate was to protect subjects and to run IRBs, we really wanted to help empower them. Because again, with this, you cost us money and yet you don't bring it in attitude on behalf of the institution, they were considered so much red tape, so much of a drain, so much of a set of obstacles and hurdles, and it was a real setup for them because they couldn't do their jobs without adequate resources. So 2 of our then board members, Natalie Reddig, who goes by the nickname Natasha, and Barbara Stanley, who's still on our board today, both of whom are still very dear to the organization and certainly to me, decided that we needed a membership organization so that these administrators and staff members who were doing yo woman mostly and yo men service as well to try to give life to the IRB regulations would feel supported, that they would really feel that they mattered, that they were being heard, that they had a place to share ideas and to vent when necessary, and most importantly, a place to share ideas, receive professional education, and to be participants in the providing of professional education. And so that was the start of ARENA. Natasha Reddig and Barbara Stanley were the midwives. It was the first organizational meeting was in Houston in 1986 at the University of Texas Health Science Center, and it took off like an idea whose time had come a while before, but was certainly ripe and ready for takeoff. So it was a huge and immediate success.
What were its goals, would you say?
Its goals were the professional advancement, professional support, and education of anyone working with an IRB. Again, that was not specified as to who that was because we simply wanted to give those who saw themselves as on the IRB side of the divide, sad that it had to be perceived as such, but it was a place to come together, learn, share, listen, and have the impact that they deserve since they were the front lines of the research protection system. Well, certainly among those who were themselves the members and the leaders, they felt, again, at last, someone is listening, someone cares. They had felt perpetually undervalued, underappreciated, as well as undersupported. I think the institution thought, this is a good thing because we don't really have the time to educate them, and we don't really have the time to support them financially or even really in any other terms. And so if they can support each other, maybe we'll hear less complaints. And I think in general, the field recognized that that professional advancement, when there were such heavy and high stakes responsibilities, was only a good thing. And so it was, there were no detractors, there was no, gee, this isn't a good idea, because it was immediately win-win. You know, the members won, and those that with whom they worked and those that they supported, in terms of the researchers and the research staff and the institutional officials and the sponsors and the feds, everybody thought, wow, this is terrific.
So who actually got really involved in ARENA? Are there stories of any particular people you want to share?
Oh, there are so many terrific people. But again, Natalie and Barbara were the midwives, the moms. They were great. Early on, a man named David Bernhardt, who had been working at Temple University, or Jefferson, I actually don't remember, Philadelphia. He was a really terrific IRB administrator, came up with the name. So I want to give big props to David. May he rest in peace. He was a remarkable man. Ada Sue Selwitz, who was the IRB administrator at the University of Kentucky, still is, but she has a much more deservedly lofty title now, became involved very early and was just tremendous. Jeff Cohen, who was then at SUNY Albany, then moved on to OPRR, the Office for Protection from Research Risks, then moved on to Weill Cornell, and now has his own consulting business, very involved in ARENA, and again, a tremendous leader, as was Ada Sue. There were so many people. They had a newsletter that Helen McGow, who was then the IRB administrator at the University of Washington, edited for many years. There were a number of people that really made ARENA. They were remarkable. Molly Green, Marky Pitts, Babette Godding, Dan Nelson, Dave Baraski, Susan Kornetsky, Liz Bankert. So many administrators who were so bright and who were doing such great things and who were so generous with their time that, you know, you could ask them over and over to teach the same topic or the same course here, there. They were always stepping up because they were aware that it was not everywhere that people were able to have adequate staff or adequate time and space or adequate institutional support to come up with good policies and procedures. And everybody was sharing. It was the most glorious of environments because there was no sense of intellectual property or don't use my procedure. It was like, please take this or please call me. I mean, the people who were involved with ARENA were the most generous mentors and colleagues I've ever witnessed in any field. It was really a privilege to be associated with these amazing people. Paula Knudsen, who was a person who convened the meeting at which it was first incorporated, was again high on the list of people who was a mentor and friend to anybody who needed help. And there were many others, but that was certainly one of the early lists. It was the Jeff Cohens, the Ada Sues, the Helen McGows, the Moira Keens, the Liz's, the Mollys, the Markies, Daves and Dans.
What was the impact on PRIM&R of opening up the conversation to this large group?
Well, it was certainly a change in our modus operandi. I mean, before we had been a board, and the board did all of the deciding and all of the policy making and all of the strategic planning and all of the direction setting. So it did take some adjustment because ARENA had its own leadership council, which, although advisory, because of PRIM&R's commitment to respectful listening, you know, it really wanted to listen. But on the other hand, it did become clear that sometimes the board's needs or desires, or at least some of the board's needs and desires, were at odds with some of the arena leadership. And so it took an adjustment, but it was never dramatic or otherwise unpleasant in the early years. And there was always this ongoing tension between our board believing and stating that PRIM&R is an organization with members versus a membership organization. And it's a very subtle distinction, but among the ways it manifests itself is that the board still was the buck stops here decision-making body for PRIM&R. And among the reasons that PRIM&R never initially wanted to have members for the first 12 years of its existence was because PRIM&R really wanted to be independent and perceived as a neutral and thus safe, quote unquote, and trusted forum. And they feared that if one of these many cohorts that was involved in research, i.e. the researchers and the staff and the feds and the funders and the IRB folks and subjects certainly, became dominant as members, then our agenda or the agenda of the organization would be guided or even controlled by the dominant interest group. So their fear was that if we had members, and if, as was and became the case, the IRB community became the majority of members, then they would drive the organization's agenda, and there are times when those agendas can diverge, when people of principle can have differences of opinion. And the most frequent one is that institutional officials, and certainly researchers as well, and funders as well, often don't want to spend money on IRBs and adequate staffing or adequate facilities or adequate equipment because, again, until the overhead systems were more sophisticated and developed, IRBs were really seen as a drain and not value added. Very sadly, that was the original impression. So the notion was that, you know, the IRB community would be clamoring, understandably, for more money, and the IOs, who were also part of PRIM&R, would be, or at least of our audiences, would be resisting. Another place where that dilemma raised itself was that institutional IRB folks are often interested in relieving what is commonly referred to as regulatory burden. They would like their lives made easier, and sometimes the regulations include unfunded mandates or do more with less, and they just keep some of the regulations just added to their load, and yet they didn't get new staff or they didn't get additional funds. So the IRB community and staff would say, stop, you're killing us here. We need more time, more staff, but we just can't do all of this. Whereas the ethicists or the policymakers, and many of those were on our board, said, money should not be reason, or even staff should not be reason to say we can't do this or we aren't able to do this. You must do this because it's the right thing to do, which is in and of itself unrealistic and unreasonable.
Another group that was not originally at the table were those involved in animal rights in the context of research. How did animal rights and its relationship to scientific research become a focus of PRIM&R's activities?
In the late 70s, early 80s, there was a lot of activity around the Animal Welfare Act because there was a very strong anti-vivisection movement. There always has been in this country, but it turned out that there was a woman in Washington who led the Animal Welfare Institute, a woman named Christine Stevens, who had the ear of several highly placed Congress people, including Robert Dole. And there was a very strong move to eliminate the use of animals in science in the late 70s and early 80s. And it quickly became apparent that if you eliminated the use of animals in science or teaching, then it would certainly increase the risks for human subjects, because it would be very difficult to pioneer any kind of new drug or surgical procedure or any kind of therapeutic intervention without first trying it on animals. I mean, I don't think many people would want to have a surgical procedure that they were the first subject. So the PRIM&R board started to, and actually it was Joe Byrne, who is still on the board. He's one of our founders and one of our truest North Stars, said, we need to start paying attention to the animal issue, both because if animals are limited, and certainly if they're excluded from being research subjects, it's going to have a huge impact on human subject research. But secondly, IACUCs and institutional animal care and use committees were just getting off the ground. And he understood that they were going to have some of the same problems as IRBs, and that they needed, or in fact would benefit from, PRIM&R's experience in bringing people together to share approaches, to share problems, that there were these two sets of institutional ethics committees that had very similar mandates to protect research subjects. So between the need to protect animal research, or at least ethical animal research, the need to help animal care and use committees, and the fact that there were so many common issues, even beyond the IACUCs, it just made sense. And so at the Tufts Vet School, there was a wonderful dean named Frank Lowe, and Joe Byrne was at the Tufts Med School, and so he arranged for Frank Lowe and I to meet. And Frank Lowe had an assistant dean, associate dean named Andrew Rowan, and we all got together for lunch and decided that it was time to widen PRIM&R's reach and to get them involved in animals. And we had a conference in the fall of 1983 on the animal research issues. When we decided to have conferences on the use and inclusion of animals in research, because I believe profoundly in the need to involve people with all different opinions, I wanted to reach out to the activist community who either opposed the inclusion of animals at all, or at least opposed the use of animals without very strong guidelines and constraints and requirements for humane care and use and to minimize suffering. And I started to ask around about who those people might be. So among them, Christine Stevens came, the woman who was the head of the Animal Welfare Institute. A number of people from the Humane Society were involved with PRIM&R early on. And Andrew Rowan told me about a man named Henry Spira, who was thought to be the most effective advocate for animals in the 20th century. Henry was a remarkable man, someone that I adore. He died 15 or 16 years ago, and I think about him constantly. He had been a longshoreman, he had been a merchant marine. Henry cared about underdogs, literally as well as figuratively. And among the first campaigns in which he got involved, when he became involved with animal rights, was one involving the Museum of Natural History in New York City, which was right across from his home. And they had been doing some research which was ethically questionable for many years. And so Henry proved to be a brilliant tactician very early on, because he got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people to stand in line at the Museum of Natural History to buy tickets, so that it would take the paying customers a long time to get in the front door. And after several weeks of doing this, the museum relented and stopped their research, which was remarkable because it had been the object of concern and complaints for many years. He then decided to take on the cosmetics industry, because animal testing for cosmetics was such a contentious issue. And there were tests, including the Drey's test, which is where they would put cosmetics into the eyes of bunnies until the bunnies became blinded. And there was an LD50 test, which means lethal dose 50, so they would determine how much of a dose of a toxic chemical or cosmetic it would take to kill an animal. And Henry immediately decided that the only way to take on the cosmetic industry was to really involve the public. So he would take out full-page ads in the New York Times that said things like, how many bunnies have to die for beauty's sake. And he started to really tackle Revlon as the main offender. And remarkably, after several of these full-page ads, pickets, public appearances, Revlon changed its practices. And now neither the Drey's test nor the LD50 test are used, and that's because of Henry Spira. And he did so many other things that were extraordinary, but he was really known for being a bridge builder. He understood that it could never be, the total exclusion of animals in either medical research or cosmetic testing. And so he was a pragmatist, and he believed that you work with your adversary and you really try to come up with common ground. And so he actually would have meetings with these Revlon and other cosmetic officials that were very cordial, and they respected him. You could not respect and even admire, and in most cases, really like Henry. He was a wonderful person. So Henry started coming to PRIM&R's meetings, and he changed everything because he was someone who could talk to, again, any scientist who was doing research that he considered objectionable, any funder that was sponsoring research that he considered objectionable, and he could do it at a very authentic but ultimately disarming way that made them really think hard, where others had tried but failed to get people to rethink their suppositions about how something had to be done. And one of the best examples of that was that American Surgical Corporation in the United States was doing a lot of animal research, much of which was considered quite objectionable by the animal rights and animal welfare folks. And Henry and Leon Hirsch, who was then the CEO of American Surgical, were on the same panel at a PRIM&R conference. That was very purposeful. And again, it was only because of Henry's, for lack of a better word, reasonableness and gentlemanliness. And they ended up shaking hands, which was really unheard of, and there were few parallels. It's like Rabin and Arafat. And it really led to them exchanging, I don't know if Henry had a card, but Leon had a card, and they got together. And again, it was this notion that when you stop demonizing the other person or the other position, change can happen. And that was really something that PRIM&R should be very, very proud of. We brought these people with such diametrically opposed opinions to our meetings, put them on the same panel with a very skilled moderator who made sure that no boxing gloves were necessary or were going to have to be removed. And people really started to listen and to start to try to find new ways of doing old and certainly in this case difficult, painful things. So Henry and Leon Hirsch is one of PRIM&R's finest moments. And Henry was just someone who he was a person of great principle, but great passion and great compassion, and the combination was unforgettable. I will never forget Henry Spira. We have a lectureship, an annual lectureship named after him at our animal care and use meetings. We don't have an annual lectureship named after anyone else at our annual meetings. There was great animus between the animal rights and specifically the animal extremists, but the animal rights in general and the research establishment. And it felt almost unreachable. Henry not aside, because he did have some remarkable successes, but in terms of camps, it was tough. And I one day was reading the Boston Sunday Globe, and there was an article called Talking to the Enemy. And of course, I was curious about the title, and so it turned out there was an organization in Watertown, Mass., still in existence, a nonprofit called the Public Conversation Project. And they had brought together, I believe, 3 women from the pro-choice movement and 3 women from the anti-choice movement. This is my memory, which could be faded and certainly incorrect, but they brought together these 6 women in secret for, I believe, a period of 5 years. These are women who, depending on the year and the issue and the, particular woman, really had no use for each other. They sometimes disliked each other. They just certainly distrusted each other, and they never thought they could sit in the same room, no less come up with any consensus. And this public conversation project served as a facilitator for these years' worth of meetings. And their goals were very simple. It wasn't to persuade anyone of the rightness of the other party or person's beliefs, but it was to try to tone down the rhetoric, see if there was any common ground, see if there was any way that they could just defuse some of the antagonism or again, kind of tone it down. Because the antagonism, particularly here in Boston, was very destructive and very obstructive. So that got me thinking, I wonder if these people would be interested in coming to a PRIM&R conference and sitting down 3 animal rights people and 3 people from the research establishment. And sure enough, Laura, the woman who was then director, whose name I have forgotten, came. And we had a couple of pre-meetings. I had to clear it with the board because this was potentially risky. Was interested. She was very interested because this was a societal issue. It was precisely the kind of public policy issue she was interested in and their project was interested in. And so we had a brokered panel with many conference calls in advance to plan it of people from each camp. And she did a masterful job of facilitating it. And we had not determined in advance, it had been a dream, but certainly not an expectation, that they would continue meeting, but in fact, they continued meeting, and they brought in other people. I think the group swelled to 10. And I don't recall for how long they met. I know that John Miller, Andrew Rowan, I believe Taylor Bennett, I believe Nelson Garnett, I don't remember the others, but there were 10 people in it. And sadly, it met for, I believe, 2 or 3 years. And sadly, it was derailed because the researchers did not feel that they had enough seats at the table. Again, there were institutional officials, there were feds, there were advocates for the animals, there were animal welfare folks, animal rights folks, there were ethicists, and there were researchers, but the researchers ended up complaining about being underrepresented. And that's what ultimately caused the dissolution of that particular effort. But it is, again, just a wonderful and enduring reminder that under the right circumstances, people who might otherwise never talk to each other, at least in a civilized manner, can not just talk to each other, but come to respect and trust each other, which is what happened both in their pro-choice, anti-choice forum and in this forum for as long as it lasted.
Did PRIM&R ever experience protesters at your animal rights conferences?
We have. I mean, not nearly to the extent that we have feared. I mean, we've more than a few times had to call the FBI if something was going on. We've had to have people monitor the listservs since the advent of the internet to make sure that our conferences, dates, and places were not being spread among the protesters. But we have had 2 instances, one in which someone dressed up like a great ape, like a gorilla, and handed out leaflets very peacefully, very quietly at our conference. And another time when 2 people came and just very silently stood there with placards, signs at our conference. We've been so, number 1, shocked by the lack of protests, but number 2, gratified, because I think that one reason we have not had more protests or any serious protests to speak of is because we've invited the other side in. We've consistently had people from Humane Society, Animal Welfare Institute, from PETA, from Physicians for Social Responsibility, from all of the groups that share the same goal, which is the humane treatment of animals as the scientific and research communities. We will not invite anyone who's condoned violence, who's obviously engaged in violence, or who in any way has flirted with the suggestion that violence could be a legitimate means for achieving an end. But short of those who condone or participate in violence, anyone is welcome at our meetings. And because that's been well known since the outset, I think the protesters would be hard pressed to choose us as a primary target, because there's so many people and places that will never talk to them, whereas we want to talk with them. We want to hear from them. In the 90s in general, there were a number of problems with scientific misconduct. Everything: fraud, falsification, conflicts of interest, publication problems. I mean, the 90s, whether it was a surge in incidents or just a higher profile in the press, because quite often before that time there was this conspiracy of silence where bad things would happen and they would quickly get skirted or buried or otherwise never see the light of day. So in the 90s there were a number of problems at many research institutions. And it wasn't just the breaches in the responsible conduct, but there were also major breaches in the ethics of subject protection, and a number of people died. So Nicole Wan died, Ellen Roche died, two very high-profile deaths, because both were very clear examples of research that had not been conducted properly. They're real ethical breaches. And the PRIM&R board had been talking for a long time about accreditation, because there was a wonderful model for accrediting every research institution that used animals. The American Association for the Accreditation of Lab Animal Care has been accrediting animal facilities for 30, 40 years, since the 60s, I believe. And it just struck many on our board as quite paradoxical that there would be accreditation and standards and a body of knowledge for the use of animals in research and none for the use of humans. And particularly since the field was growing so much more complex and so much more fraught. So our board really felt that accreditation was an essential next step, and we also felt it was essential that it be a grassroots-led effort and not a government-imposed one, because as with many things, if it's required and opposed, it becomes just one more set of obligations and people are resentful. But we felt that if it was generated from those in the community, those who are themselves affected, it would be a more effective and ultimately a more embraced effort. So we decided to start an accreditation process, and it took about 2 or 3 years of talking in the boardroom about how to proceed. I cannot say enough about how deliberate and how thoughtful and how really meticulous with attention to every detail this board was as it was laying the groundwork. And Sandy Chodash, our then board chair, was the leader of that effort, as with so many other parts of PRIM&R. Joe Byrne was highly involved, Leonard Glantz, Bob Levine. It was just a very remarkable slow dance to do it, because the PRIM&R board has wanted to do everything it touches with excellence and great care and great quality, and so this was certainly no exception. If anything, this was the most deliberate, careful thing they've ever undertaken. So we used ALAC as our example, and John Miller, who was ALAC's executive director, was on the PRIM&R board and really served as our very trustworthy and endlessly helpful guide on the journey. We hired a woman named Sue Fish, who had been an IRB professional at BU. We hired her for a period of 6 months to actually help us organize the organization. She's now a board member and very involved in the organization. We also brought on several consultants who helped us with the whole concept of how you start an accrediting organization. Sue helped with the specifics of research, but then we brought people who knew about accrediting into the mix. And we convened a small group at the Charles Hotel to come up with the first set of standards. And that was extremely exciting, because we had to come up with a body of knowledge and the standards and frame it out. We came up with a name. We wanted to make sure that it was a human research program and not an IRB, because again, for all these years, IRBs had been blamed for everything that went wrong, but never given the support they deserved to do things to the extent they wanted to. So we wanted to make certain that it was the research programs at the institutional level that were accredited and not the IRBs, because the IRBs function within the context of the entire institution. They are clearly just part of the system. Researchers are involved, institutional officials are involved, research staff. So we wanted to make sure it was the research program that was accredited, and we wanted to make sure that this would help lift the IRBs, who had often been under-resourced, as I mentioned earlier. So we named the organization, we incorporated it in Massachusetts, we wrote the first set of standards, and then we started to really think about partners. And the Association of American Medical Colleges had been involved in these discussions since it first went outside the boardroom. They had been involved in a meeting we held in Rockville, Maryland, with 50 people to talk about it. David Korn was then the vice president for research affairs at AAMC. He was terrific, is still doing very well. He's on the faculty at Harvard and was the associate provost for research at Harvard for quite a while. He was terrific, and so it was decided that the AAMC would be involved in the creation of AHARP along with PRIM&R. And then he had the very good idea that we should involve more stakeholders. And so ultimately, there were six organizations altogether that were involved. And it was a very strong and very committed coalition. AHARP was launched. Marjorie Spears was hired as the first executive director, and I believe served in that position for 10 or 11 years. And Elise Summers is the current executive director. She's a very good friend of PRIM&R's. So it's been a very, as with all new ventures, it's been accomplished many of its goals and is still a work in progress, as is every organization. Well, I'm certainly biased in favor of face-to-face meetings and conferences. I don't think there will ever be a substitute for the power of learning in a group, real time. I feel like there is something so magical, irreplaceable, and otherwise hugely transformative when people get together and have conversations versus watching a monitor, no matter how animated or educated the person sharing the information is. So having said that, I do understand that not everyone can travel for all kinds of reasons to conferences, financial reasons high among them. I think that our online programs are of the highest quality, and by those programs I'm referring to a course we have, an EROC course, which we're very proud of for people who serve on IRBs, but in effect for anybody who administers one and is involved with them at all. They're quite general, but they were designed for IRB member education. We have webinars, which are clearly the 21st century way of educating people, and I'm very proud of our webinar program. They're responsive, they're lively, they're certainly accurate and thorough, and we've gotten wonderful responses to our webinars. And we also do other things like live stream our conferences, but we still believe that getting together when possible, where possible, is the way to just enhance the richness of learning, and there is no equal. There are adjuncts and other means for sure, but we've done fine and well, in fact, with our online learning programs, but I will once and forever be a come together right now kind of girl, just like the Beatles said. I am a coalition, do or die kind of person. I believe in partnerships. I believe in my bones that the whole is always greater than the sum of its parts. So early on, PRIM&R was the beneficiary of partnerships with Chayet and Sonnenreich, the law firm that founded us. We were strong partners with Tufts University because Joe Byrne was one of our founders, as was Sid Gellis, who was also a Tufts employee. He was at the floating hospital. Joe Byrne took PRIM&R on as almost one of his children. He has 3 sons and a daughter, and I think we were the 5th child. And he became our treasurer for probably 25 or more years, as well as our trusted advisor and, again, one of our most remarkable guides. He still comes out with the best ideas at many of our board meetings. He's a remarkable man. Tufts was a partner early on. Boston University and Boston City Hospital were partners. Sandy Chodosh was from Boston City Hospital. Leonard Glantz, Boston University. And they were each respected enough at their respective institutions that they were able to ensure that PRIM&R had some wonderful in-kind and institutional support from BU, Tufts, BMC, Boston City Hospital, and certainly, again, Chad and Sonnenreich. So Leonard, for example, has been the liaison to our ability to get CME accreditation. We get our CME credits through BU, and Leonard has been the wonderful liaison in that programming. And we're still, believe it or not, we still have a nice relationship with Harvey Freistadt, who was at Chant and Sonnenreich and his firm before he just retired in the last 3 years. McDermott, Will, and Emery has been very generous to PRIM&R and done some pro bono work. So those were the early partnerships. As we grew, I would say that the partnerships were really more with the federal government, the active working ones. We became very close partners with the Office for Protection from Research Risks and its successor organization, the Office for Human Research Protections. And I've been so proud, as well as, by the way, with the FDA, NIH, Department of Energy, NSF, Department of Education. I mean, we have just had an extraordinary success partnering with the feds. And I feel like when people talk about non-governmental organizations, which is another word for nonprofits, what PRIM&R has done with the incredible graciousness and generosity of its federal partners is to embody what a true governmental, non-governmental alliance can look like. Because many of these federal organizations, at least the ones with which we deal, have hugely complicated regulations and policies and guidance. And yet they don't have either the time or money or enabling legislation to educate the community of those affected by these regulations about what they should do. So some of the heads of the federal agencies, most notably Gary Ellis, who was one of the heads of Office for Protection from Research Risks following Charlie McCarthy, used to say that if PRIM&R didn't exist, we would have to invent it, because we were companion organizations to the extent that they passed the rules and we told everyone what it meant what these rules meant, how to follow these rules, and how to not just follow the rules, but how to follow the spirit. Because PRIM&R always believed that if you behaved from an ethical imperative rather than a regulatory one or just a regulatory one, you would do the right thing for the right reason, because you thought about it, because you knew how to think critically about the situations you were encountering, because just following the rules is not the way to morality. It's the way to follow the rules. So we've had remarkable partnerships with so many federal organizations, and the friendships, the collegial relationships that have been established, not just through me, but my colleagues in this office, are remarkable. I mean, I just feel like there's a story to be told about when you share the same interest, which is protecting research subjects and ensuring that research is ethical, and you come together, a lot can happen, a lot of really good stuff. They have been so interested in what our community thinks and says, and we have been desperate to have them tell our community what they're thinking and what they're seeing and what breaches they're hearing about and seeing, so that our community can know how to avoid them. So we've also had tremendous relationships with ALAC International, the animal accreditation, with AHARP, and certainly with the AAMC, which is a very close set of colleagues. They've been tremendous right now. Ann Bonham is the Vice President for Research Affairs. She's been a tremendous colleague. Tony Mizzachi was there for 25 years, close colleague. And then we have a lot of other relationships with collegial organizations like ACRP, the Hastings Center. We have very strong relationship a strong, strong relationship with them, and several other not-for-profits that do similar work. I think that I always knew that an organization as small as PRIM&R, particularly in the first 25 years, could never do anything alone. So call it neediness, call it my neediness, call it my insecurity, call it what you will, but these relationships were born of need. But very quickly, it became clear that they felt need too. There was mutuality. And I think that with all relationships, be it organizational or individual, if you feel some common cause, if you feel some mutuality, if you feel that it's not just strictly transactional, things go well. And I really respect people who work for the government. I am a great believer in and supporter of government, good government. And I feel like it would be the Wild West all over again if we didn't have government regulations. And these regulations in particular for human subjects were born of great tragedy, Tuskegee and many other breaches. So I respect them, I admire them. We needed them, we needed to hear from them, we needed to take down barriers. So I approached them with all of those feelings, with a true wholeheartedness, and I felt like I got it back. And PRIM&R would not be PRIM&R without these partnerships, because I always joke and say that the feds are the people who are the Moseses. You know, they're holding the tablets, and those tablets are the law, and they are our Moseses. They are holders of the law, and we need to hear from them. They're our true, you know, they're telling us where to go and what to do, and it's not just about compliance. And they are grateful to hear from us. So again, it's that wonderful crosstalk and listening as well as talking that can change everything, and it has. I mean, I feel like a lot of the feds tell us, you know, I now see an entirely different, I see the field with an entirely different set of eyes and a different perspective before I started coming to PRIM&R. So it's not just, you know, there's no power imbalance. Everybody is interested in achieving the same thing, which is ethical research.